So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us this month for our Collaborating Across Difference. My name is Constance McBaron, and I am the Communications and Engagement Lead at EarthLab, and I will be your moderator for the next hour. Our Collaborating Across Difference series was formed to shed light on the difficulties and opportunities of working together toward a common goal when you come from different backgrounds, different fields, communities, sectors, geographies. So speaking of where people are located, I want to invite you to join me in a land acknowledgement. So EarthLab and the University of Washington recognize that we are on the land where numerous tribal communities have lived since time immemorial. We acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. If you are not joining us from this region, we encourage you to learn about the land you are on at nativeland.ca. So quick housekeeping items. We would like to remind everyone that this event will be recorded and will be made available on our website to reference later. Therefore, in accordance with the University of Washington privacy rules, please keep yourself muted during the event and keep your video off. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so we do encourage you to ask your questions during the presentation and panel discussion. Please use this chat function for this. Finally, if you would like closed captioning for this event, you must enable it on your device by clicking on the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen and selecting Enable. Now, for what you are here for, we're excited to present to you today a project that was developed through the EarthLab Innovation Grant Program. This program inspires and incentivizes new community-engaged and interdisciplinary research partnerships that honor multiple knowledge systems, take risks, and support solutions that show promise. Today, you'll hear from some of the members of the team behind assessing climate-driven zoonotic disease risk in Washington State. I would like to introduce you to Cory Morin, who is the Clinical Assistant Professor for the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences and a founding member of EarthLab member organization, the Center for Health and the Global Environment. Joining him today are Nicolas A, Washington State climatologist, and Karin Bumbaco, Assistant State climatologist, and they are both affiliated with the Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it off to Cory and team.
All right, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Can everyone see it okay? All right, so obviously you were introduced to me, Karin and Nick, but I do want to acknowledge some of the other members of our team who couldn't join us today. We have Hannah Oltine, who is from the Washington State Department of Health, and she was pretty vital in actually accessing the data that we use for the project. We have Christine, who is one of our undergraduate workers, and she did a lot of work collecting the climate data and processing it. Lauren Frisbee was also very helpful in processing the health data. I have a student, an MPH student, Gabriella, who is actually continuing work on this project for her master's thesis. And of course, Peter Rabinowitz, who works in the Center for One Health and did a lot of the work kind of conceptualizing the project and kind of keeping us on track. All right, so the motivation for this project is the ecology of so many zoonotic diseases are impacted by our ambient environment. And here I'm using an example of temperature, but there's any number of environmental variables, climate variables, land cover variables that impact the way a pathogen is able to survive, able to develop, and able to transfer from host to host. And so if you look to the right here, we have this kind of modified epidemiological triangle of disease that kind of makes that connection between the environments, the agent that we're talking about. In this case, it's a virus, West Nile virus, we're going to be talking about today. And of course, the host, which in a lot of diseases are human that we really care about, but there's other hosts too. So you'll see that birds are the primary host of West Nile virus. And we kind of have to make this a tetrahedron if we add this kind of other component, which is a vector. In this case, we're talking about mosquitoes, but of course, there are other vectors certain types of flies are vectors. You'll see in a second that most vector-borne diseases in the United States come from ticks. And it's important because weather and climate vary at multiple timescales. You hear a lot about climate change and how that impacts so many things, including disease. But we also have to consider some of the other variability in our climate system. So we think of kind of the natural oscillations, most famous being the El Nino Southern Oscillation, but there's many others as well, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the North Atlantic Oscillation, and these cause some kind of semi-predictable variability in a lot of our climate variables like temperature and precipitation throughout the world, and oftentimes they're isolated to specific points. And so we're sometimes impacted by ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And then of course we just have regular year-to-year variability, right? It's, you know, we have some years where we get a lot of snow in the Northwest, other years we get hardly any snow. The rain varies, the temperatures vary. So it's really important when we start thinking about some of these pathogens that are so dependent on their ambient environment. So this project originally was planned to analyze 4 zoonotic diseases, but in the end, we only ended up doing West Nile virus simply because there wasn't sufficient numbers. So some of the other diseases we were actually interested in were leptospirosis, hantavirus, and valley fever, but there just weren't that many cases where we could do a robust analysis. So we ended up sticking with West Nile virus instead. So if West Nile virus, if some of you remember, arrived in the United States around 1999 in New York. And for the first couple of years, it tended to stay around that geographic region. It spread a little bit outside of it, but it tended to stay in the northeast part of the country. It wasn't until around 2002 and 2003 that it really spread all the way across the country. And now there have actually been cases in all 50 states. Still, there's some places that tend to have higher numbers of West Nile virus and some places that tend to have lower numbers. If you look at the Dakotas, they tend to have, you know, per capita, very high numbers of West Nile virus. We're actually fairly lucky in the Northwest where we have some of the lower numbers. It's transmitted primarily by Culex mosquitoes. And in our part of the country, it's Culex tarsalis and Culex pipiens that are the most notorious vectors. Culex tarsalis is more of a floodwater mosquito, so you tend to see them around rural areas. And Culex pipiens is sometimes called a house mosquito, so we do tend to see those around our houses, anywhere we leave containers outside. And West Nile virus, interestingly enough, it's not everyone who gets symptoms. About 80% of the people who contract West Nile virus actually don't show any symptoms at all. Another 20% will show like a mild fever and flu-like symptoms. And it's really less than 1% who really get the severe encephalitis, meningitis that can sometimes lead to death. So that is, you know, good in a way that it's fairly harmful. Sorry, it's not very harmful to most people, but it can have very severe impacts on a certain part of the population. It's generally people in the age 65 plus crowd who generally get the most severe symptoms. If you look in this chart on the right, you can see for mosquito-borne diseases, West Nile virus is by far the highest number of cases. This is a pretty old chart. I think it's from 2013 report on climate and disease, but it's still pretty true now where the vast majority of mosquito-borne diseases in the United States are from West Nile virus. You will see 2 other diseases that you might have heard about, malaria and dengue fever. And you see these pretty high numbers, but it's important to note that in those cases, the vast majority of the cases are imported from other countries. So people travel somewhere, they contract malaria or dengue, and then they come back to the United States with it. So it's not actually locally acquired. Dengue, there are a few places in the country, in southern Florida and southern Texas, where once in a while you can get some small local transmission, but they're largely imported. But you do see the actual biggest burden of vector-borne diseases is from Lyme disease. There's tens of thousands of cases of Lyme disease each year. So an interesting thing about the West Nile virus transmission cycle is that it's generally transmitted between birds and mosquitoes, and that's where the cycle, the vast majority of the cycle stays. However, once in a while, after feeding on an infected bird, a mosquito will feed on a human or other mammal like a horse and transmit the virus to them. Now, humans and mammals are considered dead-end hosts or accidental hosts because once another human or a horse are infected with the virus, they cannot retransmit the virus back to a mosquito. So we're kind of the end of the life cycle. So that's pretty important because that means birds play a huge part in the ecology of the disease. I'll talk a little bit of why that's important later, but it's something we really don't understand very well because it's very difficult to study birds. It's not, tracking mosquitoes can be time consuming and labor intensive and expensive in itself. Imagine birds would be even more difficult. So when I looked, we saw that epidemiological triangle of disease, and I talked about why things like temperature are important for disease ecology. Here's kind of a pretty good diagram that shows why it gets to be pretty complicated. A lot of people ask, well, we think it's going to be warmer and it's going to be wetter in the future, so that just means more mosquitoes, correct? Why would you need to do research on this? And that's a little bit true, but it's not the whole story. First, some places are going to get wetter, some places are going to get drier. How that precipitation changes also makes a difference. Some places will have fewer days with precipitation, but it'll be more intense, so that varies. How fast things warm also varies from place to place. The poles are warming faster than the equator. Places in the US like the Southeast actually see or predicted to have some slight cooling before it warms up. Other locations are getting warmer much faster. So that matters quite a bit. And these relationships are not always linear. So for example, temperature impacts you can see temperature here, impacts vector survival. However, low temperatures are detrimental for the mosquito, but extremely high temperatures are also detrimental for the mosquito. So it's not just one way. Warming temperatures can at some point increase mosquito survival, but they can get to at a certain point where they actually become detrimental and they actually decrease mosquito survival. And this is important because on different times of the year, warming might have different impacts. In the middle of summer, it could get so warm that you actually see mosquitoes not surviving as long. However, during the shoulder seasons, like the spring and the fall, you could see an increase in mosquito longevity. So that matters quite a bit. It's not just, is it going to get warmer, it's going to get wetter, it's how's the precipitation going to fall, how fast is it going to warm, how much is it going to warm, and is it going to warm or get wetter or drier during particular parts of the year where it may be more or less important for the particular disease. So it can get pretty complicated pretty fast. So as far as Washington goes, like I said, there hasn't been as many West Nile virus cases in the state of Washington as many other parts of the country. However, one important thing is, for the most part, West Nile virus was isolated to the eastern part of the state, didn't really occur west of the Cascades. However, in 2018, there was a mosquito pool who tested positive for West Nile virus in Pierce County. And shortly after that, there was a human case in King County. So these were the first two detections of West Nile virus west of the Cascade Mountains. And so a logical question to ask was, is climate impacting this? And so that's kind of where we kind of brought our study and what part of the motivation behind it. So that's what we're asking is, are there any statistical relationships between weather conditions and West Nile virus in Washington? So our main sources of data were West Nile virus case reports, and we got those by county of exposure and the week it was reported. And we had to do a little massaging of the data. We needed to get rid of cases that occurred outside of the state, or where people traveled outside of the state when it's likely when they would have been infected. And because of that, we ended up with about 110 cases between the years 2005 to 2019. And so just to put this into perspective, that's for the entire state of Washington over this almost 15-year time period. There are some states, like in Colorado, where they've had years where they've had thousands of cases. So like I said, we're a little bit lucky in this part of the country. If you look at the climate data that we use, it's gridded climate data from GridMet. And so we were able to average it over each county, and we're able to average it weekly for 5 variables: minimum, maximum temperature, specific humidity, vapor pressure deficit, and total precipitation. So one of the problems we ran into is some of the counties are quite large in the state of Washington, and oftentimes the population is isolated to specific areas. So when we grabbed the climate data, we limited it to using grid cells where there was a minimum population of 100 people. So this has its advantages. We were able to get I'd say a better estimate of what the climate being experienced by most people was. However, there's a possibility too that some people may have contracted the virus when they were hiking, maybe much further away from a large population as well. But it was kind of one of the challenges that we had kind of using kind of mixing climate and health data. And we hope that it, kind of gave us our best opportunity to give some give accurate results. So we use a decision tree model. I like decision trees for two reasons. We decided, there were two main reasons for using them. The first is it's really easy for people to kind of understand what's going on within a decision tree. You can understand that certain statistical methods are almost kind of a black box. As you kind of throw your data in, you get an answer out, and you really don't know why it came to that specific conclusion. The second reason is that they're able to handle nonlinear relationships really well. And like I said, there's a lot of these nonlinear relationships when we start talking about how temperature and certain other variables impact mosquitoes. So I'll kind of walk you through this diagram. If you kind of look at the top box there, how they work is you look at this first condition, you say, okay, it's a minimum temperature with a -3, that means a 3-week lag. So we did not just the week that you would have actually the week of the climate when someone actually contracted the disease. We actually looked up to the 4 or 5 weeks prior to that, which obviously makes sense. If someone is showing symptoms of the disease, it's generally they've had it for about a week or two for the incubation period. And so we really wouldn't care about the climate that particular week. You'd want to know what was going on before, because those things would impact the mosquitoes and the virus and their behavior. So if you look at this first one, about 3 weeks prior, it says, okay, less than 9.61 degrees Celsius, which is about 49.3 degrees Fahrenheit. And it says, okay, if temperatures are less than that, we consider that condition true and we go to the left. And if they're false, we kind of move to the right. And if you look at the values here, it shows on the left how many instances of that occurred when there was no West Nile virus. And on the right, we see the 73. It's saying, okay, how many instances of, again, temperature being less than 9.61, or in this case higher because it's false, were there when there was West Nile virus. And so you keep following this down, and what you generally see is when you look at where most of the cases occur, which you see in this kind of bottom right box, you see out of 100 and would have been together 155 instances, 44 of them had West Nile virus. So that's pretty high. That's, again, we're talking about almost a third of the time when you get these conditions, you get West Nile virus. And if you compare that to some of the other outcomes, like on this side, like 76 cases of no West Nile virus, and like 1 case of West Nile virus during these conditions. You kind of see how the diagram works. You can kind of work your way through. If we want to look for what are the prime conditions for West Nile virus transmission, we say, okay, it needs to be above 9.61. So this condition of temperature being less, the minimum temperature being less than 9.61 degrees Celsius is false. So we move this way. We look, okay, what about the maximum temperature 3 weeks prior? And we say, okay, is it less than 30.24 degrees? Again, we move this way. And then we start getting to precipitation. And in this case, we get an interesting result that when precipitation is less than 3.6, we tend to have more West Nile virus. And then the last condition being the minimum temperature less than 12.775, we want to go false and move to this box. So you can see where we get most of our West Nile virus cases is when we get high minimum temperatures, high maximum temperatures, relatively warm minimum temperatures, and then small amounts of precipitation. Now, if we take that model and we use it over the entire state for each county, we can actually look at what the probability of reporting West Nile virus is for each week of the year for each county. And we did this using kind of the average conditions over a 10-year time period. So this first map in the upper left-hand corner is from January 1 to May 6. And the reason this is a relatively large timescale compared to the other maps is just because it was essentially 0 throughout the entire state. So you're talking anywhere from the beginning of the year all the way until late spring. There really isn't much probability of getting West Nile virus. That's simply because the temperatures are so low, they're not very favorable for the mosquito. When you really get favorable conditions is in late summer to early fall. And you can see the map here from July 30th to August 26th, and from August 27th to September 23rd. That's when you get these higher probabilities of reporting West Nile virus. And so especially in Yakima and Benton counties, right through kind of like the middle of the state. And if we move to the next slide, we actually did the same analysis, but instead of using the averaged climate variables over the entire county, we said, okay, well, what if we did it for each pixel instead? So this gives a much more detailed map, but it's important to note that these probabilities are not very accurate because most of these grid cells have such a small population that you wouldn't actually get the same probability. So what these really represent is if you took this pixel and you took its particular weather conditions and you extrapolate it to the entire county, this is probably what the probability of reporting a West Nile virus case would be. And again, you can see that it's just kind of the strip up the middle of the state, which represent kind of a lower lying area, which is going to be warmer, that you get most of your West Nile virus cases. So this is important because we are seeing warming temperatures in the state of Washington. You can see here on the left, this is August, September minimum temperature from 1895 all the way up to 2020. You can see again a fairly steady trend in warming if you average it out. And again, looking at August minimum temperature trends throughout not just the state, but the Northwest, you can see that there's many places where we're seeing significant warming and really not too much areas where we're seeing cooling or even steady conditions. You can see here kind of around the areas where we are seeing most of the West Nile virus cases in the state of Washington is also seeing significant warming. So one more thing we wanted to do is actually look at two of the counties, Benton and Yakima County, where we see the vast majority of our West Nile virus cases and say, okay, what if we compare the years in these two counties when we see West Nile virus and when we don't see West Nile virus and what their kind of probability of detection are and how they vary. And the thing is, we don't actually see much of a difference. If you look at the red line, which is the average conditions during years when you do see West Nile virus, and the average conditions for the years when you don't see it, they're actually pretty even. In some cases, you actually see higher for the negative years. And this is what I was really trying to get at when I talked about birds and how important they are. And kind of what we can take away from this is to say that a warmer year isn't necessarily going to create more West Nile virus cases. However, you can see that the seasonality is caught very well by the model. So it's really these warmer months make the conditions very suitable for West Nile virus transmission. Whether it's actual transmission or not depends on some other things, like there happen to be birds coming in that carry the virus. And remember, birds are very mobile; they travel long distances, so it could be from year to year that sometimes you do have some coming in, sometimes you don't. But it's really that window that's the most important thing. And I think the biggest risk for warming conditions is that window is pretty narrow here, right? We see it from about this is each week of the year, from the 0th week to the 52nd week. You see from about week 26 to week 40, you see cases, all right? But you don't see it the vast majority of the rest of the year. And for Yakima, it's even more narrow. It's from probably week 31 or so to about 38. But you can imagine as conditions warm, you can imagine that base spreading out a little bit. And when it spreads out, you have a longer window for when transmission could occur. All right, so that's one thing to kind of keep in note is this. This is interesting here where you get this during the positive years, you kind of get this extra few weeks during the year where you get a high probability of West Nile virus detection. So this is important for many workers or just people who like to camp and hike, right? So we have people working in forests, farm workers, construction workers, kind of anybody who works out quite a bit outside for a long period of time. Especially during those summer months, is at high risk for West Nile virus transmission. So just to kind of give a quick summary, as we can see, the late summer months are the highest risk for contracting West Nile virus. The conditions that seem to facilitate West Nile virus transmission the most were relatively warm minimum temperatures, high maximum temperatures, and some dry conditions. And it's usually 2 to 3 weeks prior to the actual cases is when we see these conditions occur. And of course, this is very important because we are seeing warming temperatures, especially minimum temperature throughout the state of Washington. And so this creates the possibility of extending the seasonality of when transmission could occur later into the fall and possibly even earlier into the spring, because it does take some time for transmission to build up between the mosquito and bird population. So we have a long time where there's a continued cycle going, you can actually get some kind of momentum behind the disease and the transmission. So the last thing is we're continuing to do future work. It'd be interesting to try to get some kind of early warning system going, kind of like we have a heat index, so that people, public health professionals can maybe give warnings up to say, okay, we're kind of at the high point in the period for West Nile virus. You might want to be a little bit more careful, wearing longer sleeve clothes if you go out during the evening, or wearing bug spray and so forth. And we also, as I said, we have an MPH student who's actually trying to do a more, I'd say, specific analysis on Benton and Yakima counties to really focus on them, and see if they can get a little bit more. She's trying to create a little more robust model. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and of course, we'll take questions.
Great, thank you, Cory. And I'd love to invite your teammates to turn their video back on for this portion, Karin and Nick. So we typically ask some questions to start out with the panel. We ask each group about the same questions to learn about the similarities and differences between these kinds of collaborations. So let's dig a little deeper about collaborating across your different fields and then with your other partners. I would love to hear from each of your perspectives. What were some of the factors that brought you to this project that made it interesting for you? And what kind of, on the other side, what kind of doubts, if any, did you have about working across fields like this? And anyone who wants to start.
Well, Nick here, I'll take a stab. And again, yeah, I was just really pleased to have a chance to be associated with the project. And in particular, a lot of my interest from the climate side is the applications to it. And I think this is just a great example of that. And so I'm just pleased that we could lend a hand in this way. And I have to give credit to Karin Bumbaco and Christine Neumeier, who did all the basically real work on this one. And I was more of a cheerleader. But I think it is something that is going to be increasingly of interest. And, one thing that it's kind of a buzzword now, but it's a real thing, environmental justice. And here, Cory's one of his last slides, one of the groups that's really exposed to this is agricultural workers. And, obviously there's all other sorts of threats they have too. And if we can do something about figuring out how to minimize that threat, and if nothing else, to kind of recognize when the conditions are favorable for this sort of thing so that they can get treatment if they do get infected, then that's kind of something that, just really appeals to me. And so, anyway, thanks.
Yeah, this is Karin. I wanted to echo that too. So Nick and I, for years, we were mostly interested in applied work in terms of climate. That's what the Climate Office does, and have tried in the past to delve a little bit into health data and kind of found ourselves floundering around. It's a different field, different sets of standards. So when the opportunity presented itself to work with Cory and the other partners, I didn't have any doubts to answer that question. I was just excited that there was an opportunity to put some work in.
Yeah, and I can say that, I knew Nick, and many of the people who are part of Change knew Nick, because he would come to some of the Change used to have something similar, kind of like a brown bag talks and so forth. That and I would oftentimes see him there. So when kind of the Earth Lab Innovation Grant, which obviously we're very grateful because this would not have been possible without them, when this kind of opportunity arose, it was really kind of a no-brainer. I think and there was a couple other people in Change who kind of talked about it briefly, but I knew almost exactly who to go to and say, okay, would you be interested in this? So that really helped that we already had some interest from Karin and Nick going into it, and that just made it very easy to find someone to collaborate with. And I believe Karin and Nick, did we try one other grant together before this, or was this the first one? I think we've been on a couple of grants. I think there's one grant we didn't get, but at least it laid kind of a good foundation about, what kind of work we wanted to do, how well we would work together, what kind of data sets we would use. So I think kind of just, even though that first grant, we didn't, it was a fail, we didn't get it. It obviously led to something, better later on. So it definitely wasn't a waste.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. So I see there's a question from Ellen Kesselman about surprises that have surfaced through this research. And, Cory, if you have, I have my own kind, but I'd like to hear your perspective about maybe what surprise you found.
So I think actually, this is kind of a weird answer, but I'd say like almost one thing that surprised me is how much I almost wasn't surprised by some of the results. So I was interested to see where I'd read some research by some other people who have done kind of a similar thing where they did some work on climate in West Nile virus, and they found something very similar, where it seemed to be minimum temperatures seem to be really important for West Nile virus risk. The thing that did surprise me a little bit was that precipitation was not nearly as important as temperature first, and then second, that it seems to be have kind of an inverse relationship. Normally you think of more precipitation leading to more habitat for mosquitoes, and more mosquitoes and obviously higher risk, and that seemed to be the opposite. It could be simply because in this part of the country, we tend to have dry summers and wet winters. And because of that, it's not so much that having less precipitation helps the mosquitoes. It just happens to be that during the time of the years when we have these warm temperatures that are conducive for West Nile virus, we also tend to have kind of lower temperatures. And this could be part of the, one of the weaknesses where we use kind of the whole state together, where Gabriella, our PhD is going to focus on just these couple counties, where if you mix too much data, you tend to get some kind of conflicting relationships they're kind of an artifact of what locations happen to have already West Nile virus, including them with some locations that have it a little bit, that are more rare. So that was actually kind of one of the surprises, but I was happy to see that our results did make intuitive sense, and they were what other people were getting before. So it gives a little bit more confidence in the results that way.
Right. And one thing, just to add to that, I want to get, other questions there, but one thing that came up in the conversation was that in some places, it could be the less precipitation when there are fewer watering holes. The mosquitoes and the birds share the same water source, and so there's that much more chance for, contact, unless compared to a period in which there's, a puddle everywhere and they're all spread out.
Yeah, and the other one related to the other one related to that is just irrigation in general, where it doesn't rain. People tend to, well, obviously, if you're agriculture, you have to water your crops, but even people around their homes tend to water more. And when you get that water collecting, and especially when you get that water collecting in areas where people are working or people are living, that's just a great opportunity to kind of breed mosquitoes and ensure there's quite a bit of contact between the mosquitoes and humans. And so kind of, we see a lot of these campaigns fighting vector-borne diseases like West Nile virus or dengue. One of the things they generally talk about is making sure that if you have containers in your yard, you try to tip them over. If you're storing water, you keep it covered, but just to try to limit the standing water, or they have things like mosquito dunks where you can put the dunks into the water, and it prevents the mosquitoes from breeding in them. So those types of things. But it makes this precipitation relationship very complicated, as opposed to the precipitation relationship is very complicated, as opposed to the temperature relationship, which is kind of fairly stable. It makes just kind of a lot of sense. We have a pretty good understanding of the thermal tolerances of the mosquito, and when can they develop, when can they be active feeding, and when does it just get too warm for them, where they'll either get so warm they'll just try to find a cool place and remain still, or they'll actually die.
Great. We did get another question in the chat. So what is the probability of West Nile becoming a pandemic in the future as climate change changes seasonal oscillations?
So I'm not sure West Nile virus has really the risk that certain other diseases would be to actually become a pandemic. There's a couple of reasons for that. It's very seasonal, simply because the mosquitoes don't do well in the summer. It's really related to you have to have the right mosquitoes for it to be transmitted. So that's it's kind of, I guess, one takeaway message for many people is that not every type of mosquito can transmit any kind of pathogen. So it's like Anopheles mosquitoes transmit malaria, and it's mostly Culex, but some other species or some other genus of mosquitoes that transmit West Nile virus. It's Aedes mosquitoes, like Aedes aegypti, that transmit dengue fever. So you have to have the right mosquito species in the right location in order for it to be transmitted. And those mosquitoes have to have particular qualities as well. So mosquitoes that only feed on birds are unlikely to transmit the virus to humans. You need a mosquito species that will feed on both birds and humans. So I don't think it's as great a risk. I think something like dengue, as it gets warmer, we have seen, maybe not quite pandemics, but in a particular hemisphere, like in the Americas, you've seen, certain years we've had huge amounts of dengue cases. We saw Zika, which is transmitted by the same type of mosquito. So those are probably the bigger risks. The thing that makes West Nile virus a little bit difficult is because that there's this huge bird component to it. And it's really a disease of birds where we're kind of accidental hosts. So it tends to be more of local outbreaks. You're more likely to see, like, there could be a year where Washington just gets a bunch of West Nile virus cases. Those I think you have to worry about is these kind of local epidemics. That tends to be how West Nile virus goes.
Thank you. Emily asked about the decision tree model. She says, I love the decision tree model because it helps pinpoint the weather conditions that make it more conducive for West Nile virus. Did you consider using other modeling tools such as machine learning for linking specific inputs such as temperature or precipitation data to outcomes?
Yeah. So I mean, we went through like the initial regression. That's kind of, that kind of should be your kind of go-to. It's such a tried and true method, but we did want to try something a little bit different, and we did want to kind of get those nonlinear relationships. We wanted something that was pretty simple. So like there's other great machine learning methods too. For example, neural networks can be very specific, but we wanted something that was very intuitive. And that was kind of our goal, is to say, if we're going to show this to the decision makers, if we're going to show it to the public, we want it to be transparent, and we want it to be something people can understand. And things like neural networks are amazing for things like, I think a lot of self-driving cars oftentimes use artificial neural networks because their ability to like take extremely complex relationships and just, train them enough to come up with to be able to recognize like letters and numbers and stop signs and stuff like that is quite amazing. But you really have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. So that's kind of why we kind of stayed away from it. And the other thing was, a lot of those methods do need a lot of cases, and we unfortunately, well, again, it's when you're working with diseases, you have this kind of unfortunate. It's unfortunate that there's not that many cases, but obviously it's fortunate because that means people aren't getting sick. It just means that if you don't have a lot of data, oftentimes it's difficult to use certain statistical methods. But yeah, Emily, it's great. There's a lot of cool things coming out with machine learning, and I'm starting to see them kind of come into different fields. Like, again, it used to be just people did regression, that was it. But now you're starting to see some of these other kind of machine learning and other interesting techniques being used for health research and climate and health research together.
Great. Abby, could this research lead to daily predictions of West Nile virus risk? Like sometimes a weather app will give you a daily pollen risk. Or is the timescale more that we may know what a particular summer or month will have the elevated risk? Like we know La Nina may lead to certain weather.
Yes, definitely the latter. We definitely cannot predict. That's one thing that's so hard about health data, is it's really hard to predict, like there's going to be a case. But being able to say these are the conditions is the thing that we could do. It's kind of like, a heat index where you can look outside and you're like, okay, it's really going to be warm today. You can't predict that like a particular person is going to have become a heat casualty of some sort, but you can identify the conditions that would elevate the risk. So that's kind of where we are. It's just too unpredictable. Again, we just don't know what the birds are doing exactly. It could make the difference between someone going outside, with long sleeves on and not getting bit by a mosquito, or going out with short sleeves and getting bit by a mosquito. Like, there's just so much randomness to it. It's hard to make it a predictive tool. It's more of just kind of a vision, kind of being a warming tool, kind of like, unlike pollen, which is a little bit more, there's not as much randomness to it. There's some kind of fundamental physical connections between those that are a little bit more stable.
I'd like to add a bit to that, and that is, in this particular case, there's some, it looks like the conditions some weeks ahead of the actual infection are important. And so you don't even necessarily have to just make forecasts, but kind of keep track of what's going on and know that, well, in a couple of weeks, there's liable to be a greater incidence of infections and so forth. And then also like to follow up on just one of the targets that we didn't end up studying. Valley fever is one that it's endemic in the desert Southwest. And it's especially bad when there are wet winters and windy summers. The fungus grows in the soil in the wet winter, and then windy summers, it gets lofted around, people breathe it in. Okay, well, then we can use, and following up on what Abby said, if it's been a favorable winter for the growth of the beastie, whatever it is, then, maybe you have a little bit of a heads up of whether there's going to be a bigger threat, for people actually getting infected. And just to add to that, the climate models are suggesting strongly, if not unanimously, that our winters are going to be wetter and our summers drier. And while valley fever is not a big threat here, if we get weather that's even more Mediterranean, maybe that risk will increase. And I know some folks are talking about that.
Yeah, Nick, that's a great point with having that kind of 2 to 3 week delay really helps, where you can, start putting up some messaging to say like, hey, this is the time where if you want to, if you have some, flower pots, empty flower pots or toys that you've left out, dump them. If you're doing irrigation, try to make sure that like you don't get large pools of water where the mosquitoes could breed. It also leaves the opportunity where seasonal climate forecasts are becoming a little bit more robust and a little bit more useful. People are starting to experiment with it. So we can't really say like, 2 months from now, it's going to be like 70 degrees, but there are some kind of reliable forecast that can say like, we think it's predicted it's going to be a wetter or slightly warmer, spring or summer, up to 6 months ahead of time. So that's something that in the future we might want to start planning with, is to say like, are these seasonal forecasts accurate enough where they can at least, they don't have to be perfect, but at least give us a better idea of what the conditions might be compared to just kind of guessing or just using the average, which is normally what we would do.
I have a question. So earlier, I think we might have talked about this when we first started working together, but I recently was thinking about it again, like because of all the COVID stuff. So knowing that West Nile virus, like 80% of folks that are infected, might not have any symptoms at all. Have there been estimates, and maybe not for Washington in particular because our cases are so low, but in other parts of the country, to how many cases are not being reported?
Yeah, I don't think there's been a lot of research on it, but there was one time in Colorado where if you looked at the maps, actually CDC, I'm not sure if they still have them, but they used to have these great maps where they would actually like every year they would have the maps of how many cases there were, and I think they would even update them like weekly. They did something called ArborNet that had some really kind of cool maps that would show you, it would track vector-borne diseases, I think even maybe at the county level throughout the country. But there was one year where Colorado really, they kept testing people for it, and they were actually testing. And when you looked at the map, you saw like, 50 cases, Arizona, maybe like 100 something, California. And then like Colorado was like 15 or 20,000 or something like that. And it was because they were, it could have been they were a hotspot. And I think that's part of the reason they were testing so much is they were kind of a hotspot the year before for West Nile virus, but also they tested so much for it. So, it's likely that the number of cases is vastly underestimated because, again, if 80% aren't showing symptoms, you're almost never going to catch someone that way. Even with the 19, 20% that are showing like a flu-like symptoms, again, you're probably not going to test for West Nile virus. You're going to assume it's the flu. It's really those 1% when people start to have encephalitis or meningitis. I think those two conditions, especially if it's occurring kind of during the summer or fall, is when you'd get red flags. You would probably catch those cases. So it's very unlikely, or I'd say like it's like this with many diseases. We're probably catching most of the severe cases, and we're probably not catching very many at all of the less severe cases. And even these numbers, I don't think are great because there haven't been a lot of studies that have actually like just gone out and tested people and then said, okay, how many of them had it? How many of you showed some symptoms? How many of them were severe? So those estimates could be off quite a bit as well.
So I have a question as a communications person, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you talk a little bit more about your approach to communicating this work or your work in general to policymakers and decision makers? Are you talking to folks now, county health departments about this research, or, what's your approach to that, and what do you need to be successful with that?
Well, I think having Hannah Olteen on the project was a huge help because she works for them. She's actually a PhD student also in, I think she was actually working with Peter too, so that was kind of convenient, but she's been working at the Department of Health for quite a while. So that kind of helps to kind of get their opinion and also kind of recognizing like what are they interested in as well and what would be useful for them. It's still, I think the biggest challenge, and Nick, Karin, you can definitely jump in on this because as people who are more climatologists, you do this all the time, is trying to get people to understand kind of the difference between like a prediction and kind of like a forecast and even like understanding climate change, right? That like, knowing that it's going to warm doesn't mean we know it's going to be exactly 2.3 degrees warmer in, 2050, right? You're kind of taking this information, you're taking all the information and you're saying, okay, given all this information, we put it all together, what do we come up with? And then what are our uncertainties surrounding it too? So like a good example was the question about like, are these going to be predictions for predicted cases, or are they more going to be kind of just warnings about the conditions being such that they facilitate kind of transmission? So kind of getting people to understand those differences and communicating that, I think, is kind of the biggest challenge, because understandably people would much rather have like a hard number that they can just kind of go with. And it's just because that's the way we work, right? Like, with anything we want to, the more certainty we have, the more accurate, we can make our decisions and our actions and so forth. So I think that's kind of the biggest challenge. But again, I think that Karin or Nick, you might be able to give a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we could. Karin, you could talk a little bit about how we work with Department of Ecology in terms of water supply and, that kind of, obviously our role there and trying to, give some predictions, but to be careful about those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was actually going to add, I believe that Hannah did present this work to her colleagues at Department of Health. And it was just right before COVID happened, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think it kind of hasn't gone far there because there's been so much focus on the current health crisis.
Yeah, that makes
that's been a.
sense. Go ahead, Cory.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those very understandable. I have another grant from NOAA working on dengue, and we had like a partner in another country, but obviously like that kind of got halfway through the grant, kind of got disconnected because people have to put so much of their resources to the particular epidemic, and that's kind of one thing that people have oftentimes have asked questions. I've got the question a lot is like, what do you think is like the biggest threat that we should be preparing for? And oftentimes I say, well, I think the biggest threat is thinking that you can predict and prepare for that specific biggest threat, right? That's not really a good way to go about things. It's to kind of prepare, it's to do the things that are kind of prepared for the largest amount of threats, right? So like, if we're talking West Nile, like vector-borne diseases, preparing for, West Nile virus doesn't make sense if all of a sudden it becomes like Lyme disease ends up out here and we're like, oh, we've only prepared for mosquitoes. And it turns out that, again, we have very few cases. I'm not sure if there's actually any Lyme cases in the state of Washington, but also that becomes a big thing and you've only prepared for one specific thing, then you're kind of stuck. And as we've seen with something like COVID, is no one could really predicted COVID. So, and same thing with Zika. So it was like, 2016 was the big Zika pandemic, especially in around Brazil in kind of, I would say like tropical Americas. We even had cases in Florida, in southern Florida, right? And that was kind of a really big deal. And, we wouldn't have known that, 4 or 5 years later, there was going to be an even bigger pandemic and completely different, right? Like one's a vector-borne disease, one's respiratory, like very different diseases. So that was kind of I think that's kind of the biggest issue is like getting people to understand that just because you didn't predict exactly what's going to happen doesn't mean you can't predict exactly what happens. Doesn't mean you can't prepare in other ways. I think that's the thing. People get too caught behind finding something very specific to try to do when there's kind of more general things that they can do that'll solve more problems.
Yeah, definitely. So we have a few minutes left, and I would love to ask one last question, bringing it back to collaboration. Here, I would like to hear from each of you. What would you recommend to folks wishing to collaborate this way, for researchers collaborating with practitioners, etc.? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think for me, it's mostly just it is casting kind of a wide net of, if you're a student, what kind of courses you take, right? So I was a geographer, which was great because I took courses in climate and then I took classes in entomology, and I'd go into these entomology classes and they'd be like, you're a geographer, what are you doing here? And I'm like, well, I'm interested in vector-borne diseases. And then you'd be in general ecology courses and sometimes microbiology courses. And when you do that, it not only helps you as a student to understand these things, but then all of a sudden your advisors have to start dealing with, when you put your committee together, if you're a graduate student, all of a sudden you'll have a committee that's made up of people from many different departments who start talking together. And you'll find that almost anybody in one particular area of research will talk to people outside of that area, either in their community or if you're in public health, you'll talk to public health professionals and state departments, our state health departments and everything. But I'm sure, and you can talk to this if you're a climatologist, you'll talk to people in weather or other people who work outdoors, like parks and rec and everything. So then if, you kind of branch things out, right? Like if your student has people on their committee from different departments, and then those people from different departments are talking to different people outside in the community or in the workforce, then you really just you create a much better network where it's easy to just kind of know and make connections between people and to kind of mix ideas together. So, you get these kind of weird collaborations that maybe you wouldn't have predicted before. So I think that's kind of the best thing, is to kind of, don't be afraid to kind of go outside. You have to go outside your subject area and just be open to be in that area, right? You don't want to go into a different subject area and pretend you know everything. Just go in there and be like, hey, I'm really interested in this stuff. What do you have to teach me? Maybe you can learn something from my area, which is completely different.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add there, and you'll have to pardon me. I have to leave here in a minute to go teach a class. But yeah, I think there's no substitution for just getting to know folks, going to seminars, and you know, workshops and that sort of thing that you might be interested in. And you know, the University of Washington, I can't imagine a better place for doing that sort of thing. And there's been just so much opportunities there that you know, that you just have to get outside your box and start talking to folks. And with that, I'm going to have to say bye. And but Karin, please jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Bye, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
I was going to say regarding working with practitioners. So Nick and I do a fair bit of that because we are involved like on the state level on preparing for drought or forecasting drought. And I think the most valuable thing that we've done there is just the building of the relationships between us and the people that work at the state. And it's just not being afraid to ask questions, you know, asking for a meeting to the point where like to really try and understand the types of products that they would need to make their job better. And it's I almost hate this answer because it's like, okay, build relationships, but it really is key to what we've done there. And then I wanted to circle back just as a last comment in terms of what was difficult for me in this collaboration is just the different languages that different fields speak, right? And so again, like not being afraid to ask questions was key for me, like in our group meetings, even though like, you know, there's health people here that are just talking about like all these vectors and wait, which one is this? And how sick does it make people? And, you know, just kind of flagging things and essentially slowing down the team, but needing to do that in order to really make sure we're all on the same page. And then, what was the last thing I was going to say? Oh, just trying to do like lit prep beforehand. So looking at other people's work and trying to delve into different fields, which is not really fun, but a way to wrap your mind around the way like different jargon and stuff is used.
Yeah, and Karin, one of my favorite examples that I had when I had a class that was specifically about climate and health is we had some people who were in the School of Public Health, others were in geography or natural resources or, you know, geosciences. And the word endemic is a great one where we're in epidemiology, when you say endemic, you mean like a disease that's kind of, it's always in that area at kind of a low level. But when you say like endemic in, you know, the biogeography or the ecology or geoscience, when they say endemic, they're talking about an animal that only exists in that one area. So like the Galapagos is a lot of endemic species. And so it means something slightly related, but also very different. And so we're having a discussion about it. And finally, one of the geologists was like, are you meaning the same thing I mean when I hear endemic? And we had to have a discussion about it, but it was kind of funny, but that does definitely happen sometimes. So you definitely have to be kind of open to that and ask questions, because it's almost guaranteed that somebody else in the room has the same question you do. So it's not there's nothing wrong with it at all.
It's a great question for life and good reminder, and I think a good thing to end on. I want to thank you both so much, and thank you to Nick for joining us today. Thank you to all of our guests. We are recording this and we'll have this video available on our website shortly later this week. So stay healthy and enjoy the sunny weather this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.